There's an understandable mistake. As an artist, it's easy to make in our drawing, but it has a huge impact, I believe, on the result of our work and on the ongoing development, on our improvement over time. And it can result in drawing after drawing that seem lifeless, wooden, boring, unrealistic even. We naturally enough focus on the skills of actually putting the ink onto the paper because they're the things that most immediately create our drawing. And yet our drawing comes from somewhere before that happens. Our drawings start from the understanding we have of what we're observing, of our reference. Our drawing starts in our understanding of what we observe, of our reference. And whatever limitations we have in our observing, in our observation, will stay with us and will appear eventually in our finished drawing. And what has been revolutionizing in my drawing has been my understanding of the observation process of what happens even before we start to strategize how we're going to do something with our pen. And that when I look at my reference seeking to understand it, there are two fundamental elements to this, both very important to the finished product. But for many people, it's only the first of these that takes place. Whereas I think of them as two sides of the same coin. They both have to be there if we're going to get a satisfactory result. So let me explain these two sides of the coin, and then I'll illustrate after that with some drawings. Now, the first thing we need to do when we're seeking to understand what we're looking at is something that is very often, if not most commonly, taught if we're learning to draw, and that we need to look at our subject and reduce it, simplify it into its more fundamental, its more basic forms. We need to see it in as simplified a way as possible. And this is whether it's a Gothic cathedral or a tree or a hairstyle or a mountain range or a crowd of people. We need to strip away the detail and see the underlying form of what we're looking at. And if our scene is made up of lots of different objects, it may well be that we have lots of different fundamental shapes, lots of basic forms that we need to identify within the scene. But it's not just the form of each one, it's also the relationship they each have with each other, the distance and the depth between them, and the impact that has on the form that we see. And again, I'll show examples of this after I finish explaining it. Because these basic forms, I need to make sure I capture in my drawing. And especially, I need to capture the way perspective impacts these basic forms as accurately as I can. And of course, perspective doesn't just impact boxes and therefore most commonly thought buildings, but absolutely everything we see is affected by the principles of perspective, all hinging on how something looks from the particular viewing position I have in observing it. Now, when I get this correct, it's not noticeable at all. We don't look at a scene where the perspective is perfect and think, wow, the perspective's perfect. We simply notice nothing at all. It looks as it should look, and that adds a great sense of realism to it. But if I get this wrong, then even if I can't see what's wrong, I still know that something's not right. So once we've seen our basic forms, our fundamental shapes in their simplest forms, we need to make sure that we can identify the impact perspective has on those. In many drawing courses, one of the first lessons is seeing and then with our pencil blocking out the basic underlying shapes. It's not quite as straightforward if we draw with pen, directly in pen, because obviously we can't erase any lines. But I still need to understand this process, and I need to visualize it in my head, and if possible even to visualize it on my paper, even though I haven't placed any marks or lines there. So drawing directly with ink, this first side of the coin is more challenging, but fundamentally it's the same. Okay, that's pretty straightforward, but what's the other side of the coin? What's the second element to how we understand our subject? At the start, before we put the pen on the paper, That's so vital, because this is the part that has revolutionized my drawing, that as far as I can see has really fast-tracked my drawing development, that has let me draw better, more difficult scenes, even scenes that I would never once have dreamt of attempting to draw. Not just is this not so intuitive, but a lot of the drawing courses that start with blocking out rough shapes, I think actually progress after that in an unhelpful direction. And because of that, I want to start by explaining what this unhelpful direction is, because I think it's the contrast between that and what I'm going to say is the helpful thing that will really help understanding of the more helpful thing. And that is that what's often taught is that once we've blocked out the underlying basic forms, that then we add the details onto that, over the top of that, or around that. And it's in this stage, in the adding on of the details, that so often I see drawings that have started promisingly come to grief, where I see the intentions of the artist being derailed. And I think for this reason, many people have made comment to me that it's drawing the details that causes their greatest problems. That's the point where they feel their drawings, looking okay at the start to go downhill. And I think it's because this way of thinking of doing the blocking out and then adding the details is actually less helpful than another way of thinking about the process. And it's this: once I've seen the basic form, rather than be focused on adding the details to that basic form, I need to visualize the effect of those details. I need to see the overall effect of all that detail taken together, not to prematurely start breaking it down into its pieces. Now, for simpler subjects and for things that we're seeing quite close up, the effect of the detail and the detail may be exactly the same. And I think, unfortunately, this helps add to the confusion. Let me try and explain the difference this way.
Here are some leaves from the Australian turpentine tree. Now, if I were drawing this, I'd be looking at these leaves as details and drawing each one separately because of the relatively large size of each leaf to the overall scale of the drawing. But when I look at these same leaves on their tree, it's not helpful to try and draw the detail over the top of the form, because the detail, the leaves, are overwhelming. And from this distance, it's challenging to see the detail, to see the individual leaves, let alone draw it. I need a new way of thinking, which is the key to capturing a sense of realism in our drawing. I need to see the overall effect of the detail, not the actual detail, not the precision of the detail, but how it looks as a whole. It's an effect I need to capture with the marks I use.
My challenge is to not see the details before I have to, but to see the overall effect as the visual focus that I have, because it's that overall visual effect that could be way better the thing I try and draw than the actual detail. It's the effect of all those leaves I want to draw, not leaves themselves. And exactly what visual effect these masses and masses of leaves taken collectively, seen as one thing rather than as many, has, is determined not just by what they are and their individual shape, how that appears together, but on the lighting conditions, on the air clarity, on the colour perhaps that the leaves are, and certainly on the light and the shade that the particular position of the sun or of the lighting at that moment has on what I see. And even on the same tree at the same time, the visual effect of some of the leaves may be quite different to the visual effect of other leaves in other parts of the tree. And this is where careful observation is key, because if I just even look at the effect of perhaps the most prominent part of the tree and think, oh, okay, that's what it looks like, and now I just look at my drawing and reproduce that effect over the whole tree, I will still end up with very much an artificial looking drawing, because that's not how it is in life. The effect changes as the conditions with which we view something change. And it's this distinction between then trying to see the details, which leads us to try and draw the impossible very quickly, rather than trying to see the effect of the details, which I think is the key point. And this is a skill I need to achieve, firstly, in my observation and my thinking, but then secondly, I need to develop the marks with my pen to capture whatever effect I'm seeing. Whatever effect I'm looking at, I want to be able to have ways of showing that in my drawing. Now, this is the challenge. Although I believe that many of my videos will give you a head start in your working out helpful marks that you can make to achieve the effect of what we see. Because if I firstly have my basic shapes fundamentally correct, looking the way they look from that perspective, and then I create marks that capture the, if you like, external effects on those basic forms, I'm going to start to create a very realistic representation of my drawing. I'm going to capture visually the essence of what we see in a way that starts to look realistic. And if you want to see and consider how this looks in subjects other than leaves and trees, I do have a playlist on drawing the effect of detail that showcase this principle in many different subjects. And I'll link this playlist with the end screen if you want to go and have a look and see just how flexible, how adaptable this general mindset can be in particular circumstances with particular subjects. And if you haven't hit the like button yet, then why not do it now while I rummage around and find some drawings that I can use to illustrate this principle of seeing and drawing the effect of detail. We'll start with this small architectural historic structure where the effect of the detail was both in the actual detail of the architecture, but also in the weathered edges of the sandstone, with the nicks and breaks and the rounded edges, not drawing the detail, but suggesting it, working out the marks that would create the effect so that it didn't look brand new with hard edges. A less common view of the Sydney Opera House, creating the effect of a crowd here in a very gestural drawing, with very few marks in fact to indicate the sense of a crowd arching right around the quay. And sometimes the marks that we use and the effect we create changes depending whether what we're looking at is in fact the focal point or whether there's a different focal point, and this is of less visual prominence. This historic sandstone tower in the south of France has its cupola made of wrought iron, and this is a very simplified capture of it, but which still contains the suggestion of the detail without having to draw it. In this historic arch in London, we see an example of drawing the effect of detail for architectural sculpture, where we don't want to get caught starting to draw little men and women and horses and angels and whatnot. So I'm trying to capture the broad shapes and shadows of what we see, as well as in the architectural details, these Corinthian columns and these fairly ornate and detailed architectural sections up here. Or it could be capturing the effect, the visual effect of the plumpness of an eiderdown, the marks that we use to convey that this is an overstuffed eiderdown. Or the marks we use for a piece of brassware with hard polished edges, where we want that sense of metal strength and sharpness to come out, but we also want marks that will capture this low relief band of roses that wraps around, that creates just the right effect of just how much this relief comes away from the surface and how perspective affects it as it wraps around the curves. Or it may be a closer view of an architectural sculpture where we have architectural details which in life have great detail carved into them, but we want to create the effect of that. Pair of old boots, what marks will create the effect, the old weathered effect, the ins and outs of these battered boots. How about a cow skull? The detail that we see in the surface, which is smooth and yet not quite smooth, which catches the light and has little weathered marks and little marks where various anatomical features moved in and out of the skull. What marks will capture that rather than trying to draw all that detail. Or perhaps a flock of ibis in Sydney. Marks that will indicate the shape of the bird as well as the shade that they have on them, but also what marks will create the shadow effect. How do we draw the shadow that also reveals the grass that these birds are standing on? What about a car? How do we draw what we see in or through the car, capturing the various effects of light reflecting off and light penetrating through that lets us see detail? Here's another take on a bird and marks to draw the three-dimensionality, also marks that we can use to create the effect of the shadow on quite long grass. Or what about how we capture the detail of one of the carved grotesques on Notre Dame Cathedral in Paris? The marks that also create a sense of weathered stone and of deep shadows that also reveal the form of the statue. What about water? How do we draw the detail of water in a moving ferry? How do we draw the detail in a pineapple? And while this may look detailed, compared to the reference or to a real pineapple, this really is a simplification, but I've had to pay careful attention also to the way these sections change as they move around the pineapple. Marks to capture very sparse foliage, not a giant canopy. And to capture the fact that we have weedy growth at its base, that is a very different type of vegetation to this, but not wanting to overdraw the detail, keeping the focus point the focus point. Here we have again a very gestural drawing. The challenge was to find marks that would represent the detail of this bench hewn from large pieces of raw timber. This sense of roughness. What marks will help create the sense of distance between on the ground between here and further up. Here we have another crowd where we have some figures that are close enough that we can start to see the face, but we have crowds right in the distance. And yet I don't want to spend the rest of my life drawing all the people. So how do we draw the effect of the people? What about engineering structures? How do I draw the detail of the steel girders and their crisscrossing, interlacing patterns that are layered over each other from this angle so that it's clear what's happening, and I provide enough line work to show just how much metal we see from this angle without having to be so precise in what I draw that it will be impossible to capture it accurately. Here we have marks to draw the detail of cobblestones. Or what about marks that create the effect of a landscape where we have quite a lot of elements? We have marks for gravel on the ground, we have marks for foliage, some of it close, some further away, some very far away, and we want to create the effect of distance. How do we capture the brickwork in this building without having to draw all the bricks? How do we capture the effect of all of the detritus, all the bits and pieces that are on the ground here, which are really important when the foreground takes up half the drawing? How do we draw a thatched roof? How do we create a sense that this is a thatched cottage without drawing endless detail of lines to represent the thatching? What is it that we can see that we can use in our marks for that? And it's the same with this clipped hedge in the front. How can I make it clear that this is a clipped hedge without drawing thousands of tiny marks? How do I draw long grass? How do I draw weathered timber and capture all the detail of the weathering and the impact that has on undressed timber trunks? How do I capture the effect of stone blocks without having so many stone block lines crisscrossing our drawing that that's all we see? How do I capture the effect of shadows on grass with something more complex such as a tree? How do I capture the effect of bark on trunks? How do I draw the detail of shade as well as shadow? And sometimes to draw a scene of nature means there's a lot of consideration of marks to create the effect that we want. We want the effect of unimaginable detail without having to draw it. But once we, if you like, master this way of thinking, there are endless possibilities, and we can use these marks in a fairly sparse way or in a more intense way, whatever effect we're trying to create. But the aim always is not to get caught up in seeing the detail, but to see the visual effect of the detail and to seek to capture that. And it's in doing that ironically we capture a greater sense of reality than if we actually try and draw all of the reality. G'day, I'm Stephen Travers. Look, I hope you found this really helpful because I think it's absolutely key. I think this is the secret to my drawings and why they look the way they do. And if you haven't looked at my playlist on drawing the effect of detail, look, I can really recommend watching a couple of those videos at least. But look, whatever you draw, and however you draw it, detail or effective detail or no detail at all, make sure you have fun. I'll see you next time. Bye.